trying to instigate world war. By July of 1914, you have the official declaration of war of Germany onto Serbia, even though Serbia wasn't totally a independent country. And this kicks off the alliance system. So you have different countries. Somebody will come to the aid of Serbia, and then someone else will come to the aid of that country, and back and forth and back and forth. The Germans appear to have been planning for something like this for quite some time, because once the war officially breaks out, they have a plan. They realize that geographically speaking, they aren't sure how soon they want to get involved in a two-front war, meaning they would fight over here, this would be the Western Front, but on their eastern front, of course, would be Russia. And how do you deal with that situation? So they came up with something called the Schlieffen Plan, which was a very simple plan, supposedly, that they would march into France, and they'd be able to take over France first, and then kind of march, swing back through, capture France, swing back through Germany, and then get ready for the Russians, because they felt that the Russians were very slow in mobilizing. What France ends up doing is actually taking much longer to surrender. So for the Germans, it takes 39 days for France to fall to Paris, and then it takes an additional 3 more days before all of France officially surrenders. Meanwhile, what this had done is it allowed the Russians to properly mobilize, and the Russians begin to come across East Prussia into Germany, and the Germans aren't quite prepared for that. So what you get is a war on the western part of Europe, the continent, and an eastern part of the continent. It doesn't take long for the propaganda machine to get going, and you have propaganda posters throughout the war, all sides, but you start to get reports supposedly of these German atrocities that happened when they just went storming through Belgium. I don't really know to what extent this was true, but if anything, it really does fire up the Western Alliance countries and wants them to take on this brute, if you will, that resides in Germany. Many nations viewed the outbreak of World War I as an opportunity to show its nationalism on a grand scale, and many countries were very excited for it. Keep in mind that there was almost an entire generation that had never experienced a major war, and they didn't really understand the true horrors and what it would involve. So you have countries like Great Britain and Germany and France that were having parades, and guys were running down to the recruitment offices because they were so excited to be involved in a conflict like this, and they also thought, oh, it'll be short-lived, we'll be home by Christmas, and I don't want to miss out. This is the first armed conflict on a worldwide scale that includes colonial powers, and we also, of course, see the impact of imperialism as a result of that. So throughout the rest of this PowerPoint, you will see some groups from different parts of the colonial holdings, I guess you could say, that were involved in the conflict, like this young Australian recruit. This chart indicates the millions of soldiers that were mobilized by the 4 major powers. This doesn't include the U.S. because we are not present at the outbreak of the war in 1914, so we don't have those statistics. But notice the sheer amount of men that Russia has, which may or may not be surprising to you, but Germany mobilizes 11 million, and many of those guys are going to be ones that will leave high school early, or they'll kind of expedite or speed up their high school graduation. So you have quite a few German 16 and 17-year-olds that are heading off to the war front. Many people believe that World War II was the only war in which women were directly involved in mobilization or other areas, but World War I was really the first kind of test run for women and female involvement, rather. The U.S. will actually have ultimately 30,000 women that are involved in military operations in some capacity. Of course, they're not fighting on the front, but they'd be working primarily in like clerical positions and in certain medical facilities. So let's look at some other ways in which women were involved in the war. They were used quite often in propaganda, whether it be in trying to finance the war, trying to get people to buy liberty bonds or bonds in which the government could essentially fundraise for the country's war effort. They may have been used as recruitment tools, which I always thought this to be a somewhat provocative poster for World War I, if you think about how conservative values were, at least when the outbreak of the war happened. At one point, the U.S. government actually the U.S. Navy got sick of waiting for Congress to officially get involved in the war and to pass enlistment kind of rules and quotas. So the Navy actually started recruiting guys before we even got involved in the war. It should also be noted that between 1901 and 1908, you had the establishment of Army and Navy Nurse Corps in the United States. So we actually had females working in our military medical fields before the outbreak of war. Many women worked as munitions workers in a variety of countries, and so the next couple slides will show some of that. Keep in mind that all these things really relate to the social part. Socially, what does this do if you start to have women being involved in the war, and does that start to change the dynamic within the society back home? So here's a real photo of French women working in factories, most likely a munitions factory. Here are their German counterparts doing much the same work. In the U.S., we employed women to work in the fields, and certainly other countries did this as well. Primarily when you start to take the young men away from the farms, you still need to produce food not only for the nation, but obviously for the war effort, so many women started helping out on farms. Great Britain in particular used women as ambulance drivers for the British Red Cross. This poster I always found somewhat humorous because I'm not really sure what gender it was appealing to. It's supposed to be recruiting women to join the Red Cross, but I'm pretty sure Red Cross nurses don't wear those outfits, so I always thought this one to be a little entertaining. Here is what the British women would wear to work in their auxiliary corps. And the auxiliary corps typically would do meals and social events and work at the hospitals and kind of in charge of general morale for the troops. And then we get to the Russian women, and these gals, some of them scare me. I'm not going to lie, I would not want to encounter them, but Russia did actually allow women to be soldiers as well, particularly as the war went on. And they started to lose so many men, they started to allow women to serve. And then finally, some women also worked as spies. The picture here is of the famous Mata Hari, which maybe one of you want to look at her a little bit closely for a project, but she was actually a German spy who has a very interesting, colorful past. She ultimately was an exotic dancer, but ended up kind of, we could say, getting together with certain British officers, and those officers would spill all sorts of secrets to her, and so she was able to relay those back to German officials. Ultimately, she is going to be captured by the British and will be executed, even though it's reported that she never thought she'd actually be killed. In fact, the day that she was set to go out in front of the firing squad, she put on all white gloves, white hat, and she just kind of stood there real pretty like and assumed that nothing would happen to her, which unfortunately it did.